If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what has been your scariest encounter with another human being in the woods, outdoors, on trails, etc.? Years ago, my dad, brother, and I hiked half a dome in Yosemite. It's an all-day hike, and we got a later start than we wanted and got off the dome as the sun started to set. It started to get really dark as we were still miles and hours out from the end of the trail. It definitely wasn't our plan, but thank goodness for prepared dads, and my dad had packed headlights and flashlights. We ran into another group at one point, stranded still on the trail without lights, and they joined us hiking back. Actually, at night in the middle of a national park, there is the darkest darkness I have ever experienced. No lights, and you can seriously barely see your feet, and that's a generous statement. Right around 11 p.m., when we still had about 2 hours of hiking until we were back, we saw a lone hiker walking towards us on the trail. She wasn't headed back down the mountain but further up the trail. Our group was about 8 people at this point. As soon as we saw her, we were all speechless. She was an elderly woman with frizzy gray hair and bloodshot eyes. A scrawny young man was hunched over, standing behind her. They had no lights. My dad was the one who finally spoke to her, and all she said was, "I have been following the deer hundreds of miles, and they have led me here to you." All of us were frozen. She continued on, hobbling past us, and the guy she was with followed close behind her. They wandered on out into the darkness of the path. We all basically ran the remaining miles back to camp. I still get serious chills thinking about it. I was driving with my friend through a popular park in our city when we came to a dead-end parking lot, trying to find a certain trail. We started to turn around when a man who was at the trunk of his car ran up to the passenger side of my car, panicking and throwing his arms up. I immediately think he's broken down, needs help, or maybe something is wrong with my car. I lock the doors and roll the window down a crack to hear what the issue is. When he came closer, I got a very uneasy feeling. The guy just didn't seem right. He smiled and asked if we had ever been to some store in the local area. He offered us candy and told us to take a look at what we wanted in the back of his car. What a cliché. Keep in mind that I was 21 or so at the time, not a child. At that point, I'm accelerating to get the duck out of there, and as we're pulling away, another man comes down the hill with a huge stick in his hand and immediately tries to flag us down too. I sped off and saw them talking together and watching as I drove away. On the road out, we saw a woman jogging towards where we had just had this super creepy encounter, and I pulled over immediately and told her to turn around. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I had just let her jog into a weird-ass situation like that. I have no idea if those men wanted to kidnap someone, kill someone, or what, but I'm glad we got the duck out of there. I haven't been to that park since. My girlfriend and I went camping one time, and we were enjoying ourselves when 2 guys walked up that we had never seen before. They began talking, but they were obviously drunk and also armed, as they were hunters. After maybe half an hour of friendly chit-chat, the older guy gets really quiet and looks at me and says, "How much do you weigh?" I chuckled and told him about 220 pounds. He looked at me, looked at my girlfriend, and then said, "I could kick your ducking ass." I've had maybe 3 or so years of MMA training, so I wasn't intimidated, but he kept going on, saying how he could drag my ass all over the campsite or how if he shot me, people would believe it was an accident. My girlfriend and I excused ourselves from the camp to use the restroom and purposefully took a long time coming back. When we got back, they had left. Fast forward 2 or so hours, and I'm perched in my hammock, and I hear rustling outside. I knew it wasn't an animal, so I threw on my headlamp and quickly got out of my hammock. Dude came back to our camp with no light, saying he was looking for his phone. Needless to say, I yelled at him and stayed up the rest of the night sitting by my girlfriend's hammock with a knife. Super freaky guy. My mom's bad feelings might have saved me as an infant. She was walking with me in a stroller down her suburban neighborhood street. She says she started to feel a tingling feeling like she was being watched, so she decided to turn around and head back home. A few streets later, she noticed a car driving slowly behind her. The driver, a man, was starting at her and me. She starts walking a bit faster and notices he drives a bit faster to keep up, so she gets really scared. Before she can start running, this is the 90s and she didn't have a cell phone, he rolls down the window and tells her not to run or stop because she's being stalked by a coyote. He saw her safely to our doorstep and then pointed out the coyote, who had followed us half a mile and looked rangy and desperate. It had been slipping from brush to brush, looking for an opening. So glad for her intuition and the stranger's help. Well, I was walking home. I wasn't late, and I'm from a pretty safe area, but it was that time of year when it starts to get dark really early, so I felt kind of ominous. Anyway, I pass this guy in a red sweater and red tracksuit bottoms, and he looks at me funny. Maybe he's high, maybe he's drunk, either way, something is not quite right about him. I keep going. Look behind me, he's still there. Cross the road. He crosses paths with me. As soon as I turn a corner, I sprint to my apartment complex, run into the coded gate, and wait. He rocks up a minute later and stares at me through the gate. He just stares at me for a good 10 or so seconds, then runs back the way he came. Shivers. When I was 15, a friend and I went for a lot of walks around town, a small town with around 5 to 6 people. We were going to the cyber cafe in town to meet a few friends, and we often took different streets to get places, just to keep it interesting. We were about to go to Main Street off one of the side streets when a man on a bicycle approached us. He got off his bike and asked us a couple small talk questions. Something didn't seem right about him. He was probably in his mid-40s. We both kept inching away but didn't want to come off as too rude, so we answered about the weather or traffic. Then he paused, and we said we had to go, and he said, and I'll never forget it, "You look so young, I don't want to get in trouble, but I need to touch someone. I just need to touch you. You should come with me." And he started rambling. I just felt terror, I couldn't even speak. I grabbed my friend's hand and turned. We sprinted the rest of the way to the cafe, and as soon as we were inside, we asked to use the phone. I called my mom to pick us up while my friend told the worker what happened and what the guy looked like. A month later, I got my first cell phone. Girls' camp was my last year. Me and a small group of girls wanted to climb to the top of this big hill that has a beautiful lookout above the trees and a clear view of the sky. It was a new moon, and there was zero light pollution. We grabbed our flashlights and got on the trail. About 3/4 of the way up, the two girls leading us stopped dead in their tracks at the same time. One whispered to the other, "Do you feel that?" I was right behind them and heard what they said. I looked up and around. I didn't see anything, but something in the air made the hair on my neck stand on end. It was just too quiet. I started to feel very vulnerable and scared. One of the girls in front turned and said, "We need to go back. Don't run." One girl asked why not run, and they said, "Don't trip." Valid reason, but I don't believe it was the real reason she said it. I went camping with some friends, there were 3 of us, and we found a remote area about an hour's walk from the hiking trail. After the first night, my 2 friends realized we didn't have enough supplies, so they both decided to walk back to the car and drive to the nearest store. This would be about a 3-hour journey there and back. They insisted that I wait at the campsite alone, and I reluctantly agreed. About 2 hours after they left, I tried to distract myself by reading my book. I am female and was 21 at the time. Dusk is approaching, and I am finding it harder and harder to see the words on the page. I start to hear footsteps in the forest, and I assume it's my friends returning, but I'm confused as to why I can't hear any voices. I then hear deep, sinister laughter, and my heart drops. I tell myself that my friends are just trying to scare me, but the laughter continues and gets louder. Suddenly, I see a figure to my left, about 10 meters away, standing on the other side of a stream, staring at me. This figure is dressed head to toe in formal wear, including a top hat. This was in the middle of the forest in far north Queensland, Australia, so it is an extremely odd and terrifying sight. He also has a strikingly disfigured face, likely from serious burn scars, but to my 21-year-old self, he looks like a character from The Hills Have Eyes. The man laughs deeply again while staring at me, and I am frozen stiff. He asks me what I'm doing here, and I calmly reply that I'm waiting for my 2 male friends to return. My only sense of safety comes from the barrier the stream is creating between this man and me. If he were to charge at me, the stream would slow him down, and I would have time to run to the forest. He asks me a few more questions, and I continue to respond calmly and nonchalantly. I begin to get the feeling that I am not giving him the reaction he wants. He then says he saw another group of campers a few kilometers upstream and that he would go visit them next. He leaves, and I'm staring blankly in disbelief. My friends return about half an hour later, and neither of them believe what I tell them has just happened. My pleas to leave and head back to town were ignored. Needless to say, I barely slept for the rest of our camping trip. It was early 2019, and I was with my girlfriend at the time, walking through the woods near my house as we often did. We were having an intense argument over something stupid when I noticed something through the trees off the trail to where we were walking. It was a man wearing a dark top and blue jeans. People came in these woods all the time, but what was weird is that this man wasn't on any trails, he was in the middle of the overgrowth. I told her to shut up. I know it was a bad idea, especially in an argument, and she just got madder at me. I told her again and told her to look in the direction I was looking. At first, she didn't see what I was talking about, so I told her to look for blue since the man's jeans stood out the most. Then she saw him. A man walking through the overgrowth is following us. I didn't know who this guy was, but he looked older. Still, I wasn't taking any chances, especially with my girlfriend there, so I told her, "Let's go, we have to leave," and we walked faster. The trouble was that we were in the middle of nowhere and far from any exits, and to be honest, my girlfriend at the time wasn't exactly physically fit, so walking fast was hard for her. We walked as fast as she could, and I kept looking behind us, and that old man was still following us in the overgrowth, obviously trying to remain hidden. We ended up leaving the woods and never going back there together. I've been back there many times since alone and have had a few strange encounters with another person that looks kind of like the old man, but I can't say for sure it's the same guy as he is always watching from afar. He never does anything besides follow from a distance, but I've seen him a total of 3 times. I've staffed a summer camp for 5 years now. A long-standing tradition is that some of the senior staffers regularly sneak out during the night and drive into town to hang out and generally be hooligans. Me and 4 other guys pushed a car around the bend from the parking lot, to avoid waking up the adults, then hopped inside and headed towards the town. After a couple hours of jokes, Baja blasts from Taco Bell, and teaching one of our goons how to drive in an empty parking lot, we're driving down country roads, joking around, and listening to music. That is, until we turn down a random road and something immediately feels off. It's about 3:30 a.m. as we start down a hill, and suddenly the road goes from asphalt to gravel to dirt. We notice an old, rusted boat trailer on its side, a bunch of old tools, rotting piles of wood, and a general mess. When we reach the bottom of the hill, there's a big shed with a garage door that's wide open and another shed seemingly made out of plywood with a door creaking open. There's a light shining through the crack of the door, faintly flickering, and a fuse box right outside the door. The mood of the car changed in an instant. For just a moment, we all sat in silence, watching the light flicker. No one said anything, but we could all tell that something didn't feel right. Eventually, to ease the tension that we were all feeling, we started to joke, as teenage boys do, jeering at one of our friends to go turn off the light or open the door, when suddenly the door creaked open. The next few moments are a blur, but I can assure you that this was the fastest an early 2000s Toyota Camry has ever booked up a dirt road. All 5 of us stayed just about silent during the 15-minute drive back to camp. Something about the aura of the place felt off. To this day, when I imagine sitting in the front seat of that car, I get an uneasy feeling in my stomach. Was someone behind that door? Why were they there at 3:30 in the morning? A friend and I were exploring an abandoned hospital, and the way it was set out was via a bunch of joined buildings. All the windows and doors were boarded up aside from one place where we could squeeze in past a loose board, and the layout meant that once we were in through there, we had access to pretty much the entire main building. Obviously, it was darker than dark in there, and we have to remember which wing we'd come in from. We had flashlights, so it wasn't too bad, but then we got to this room where there was a lot of cool stuff left behind, beds, filing cabinets, etc., and we wanted to take pictures, so we turned the flashlights off so we could use the flash on the camera. We did this for 10 minutes or so, only seeing the room in the bright flash from the camera. Everything was cool, and then we both slowly became aware of noises. Usually an abandoned building is pretty quiet, apart from water dripping and wind doing weird things, but we could hear floors creaking, doors creaking, and the occasional scrape or crash of metal against the floor. Basically, it sounded like someone was blundering around in the dark. Now, the layout means that in order to get back to where we came in, we have to walk back towards the noise. There's only one route. We're getting freaked out, so we start moving back through the rooms, stopping to listen all the while. Finally, we get to the side hall that we came in from, and we bolt to the door at the end, finally risking turning the flashlights on and making noise. It's the wrong ducking door. We stand there, listening to the footsteps get closer. We're frozen, standing in the dark, totally cornered. If whoever or whatever is making that noise comes down this short hall, we're ducked. We wait and listen, holding our breaths. The scraping and shuffling approaches, slowly comes past, and then fades. We wait a bit, and then creep out of the hall and into the main building again. Carefully, we move one hall over, where we can see a sliver of light from the loose board. We quietly make our way towards it. Then we hear an almighty scrape and bang behind us, as though someone tipped over one of the huge metal filing cabinets. I mean, it was loud. I yell, "Time to go." And we sprint for the door, and there are clear footsteps right behind us. We launch ourselves through the loose board and down the overgrown path before taking a quick look back. We can't see anything through the small gap, but we do not stick around to see if that changes. When I was about 9 years old, my family and I lived in a house with a fairly big wooded area behind our backyard. I say fairly big because it wasn't big enough that you could really get lost in it for very long. It got pretty thick in some areas, and you couldn't see any of the houses from the neighborhoods once inside. To my friends and me, it was a magical world. We played in those woods all summer. My mom would let us go in there as long as we were back by sundown. My best friend would come over, and we would run out there and play for hours. We had a favorite tree to climb. Sometimes, when I got bored at home, I'd go out there by myself. I'd climb really high in that tree and just think about stuff. I loved being way up there. It was so peaceful and calm. One Sunday, I decided to go out on a solo mission in the evening. I knew I didn't have too long before dark, so I hurried into the woods to get a good climb in. I was up in my spot in no time. I remember it was late summer, and the weather was still warm late into the evening. I wanted to be able to see a little bit of sunset, and then I'd climb down and hurry home. I just sat up there and daydreamed as I waited for the sun to begin to set. Then, I heard a twig snap on the ground, and I looked straight down, and I saw a man standing at the base of the tree, looking up at me. I remember he was wearing a filthy brown jacket, and he had a patchy beard. His hair was sticking up at random places, looking like he had been relentlessly running his fingers through it. He was just staring at me with a bizarre expression that seemed to be one of wonder and delight. It was an extremely unnerving look. There was almost a look of someone who just realized they stumbled across gold at the end of a rainbow. That's the only way I can describe it. It made my blood run cold. I went completely numb, like I'd been injected into my veins. I didn't know how long he had been watching me before I noticed him. Thinking about that still makes me shiver. We just stared at each other for a moment. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. It sounds strange, but I didn't want to scream or tell him to go away because I had this feeling that told me not to provoke him in any way. After a few minutes, he said, "Are you coming down anytime soon?" I shook my head back and forth. I didn't know what to say to him. It was clear I was very uncomfortable at this point, and that should be enough to make a decent person go away, but he only grinned at me. Then he reached his hand up and grabbed the bottom branch of the tree, as if to test it to see if it could hold him. I do believe he may have been planning to climb up to me, but the lowest branch was flimsy, and it was not strong enough to hold a grown adult. I thank God for that. He soon realized this and gave up, but I had seen enough. I finally broke my silence and started to yell for someone to help me. I kept screaming and screaming. The man backed away a step or two from the tree and began to mumble and curse under his breath. He flailed his arms in the air in a rage and began making a motion like he was pushing an invisible person in front of him. Eventually he turned and walked away, sort of stumbling with each step. I don't think anybody heard my cries because nobody came to help me. I stayed up in that tree for what felt like hours because I wasn't sure if he was really gone. Finally, I climbed down because the sun was beginning to set, and I couldn't bear to be out there at night. I hit the ground and bolted back to my house, positive that he would pop out from a shadow and grab me. He never did. I made it home and told my parents. My dad went out to look in the woods, but he never saw anybody. We stayed in that house for about another 2 years before we moved across town to a bigger house. I never played in those woods again for the rest of our time there. I still think about that man sometimes. What would he have done if I had come down? I have no idea. But that question does keep me up some nights. It happened a few hours ago. I was in the park with my younger brother, just playing football and having a nice time. Suddenly I see a man looking over in our direction. However, I can't be too sure because I don't have my glasses and I don't want to scare myself for no reason. He's carrying an orange bag, so it's easy to see him. I ignore him and my brother, and I start walking around randomly, not following the path, backtracking, just not walking logically if that makes sense, kicking the ball to each other. The last time I went to this park on the 1st, a man of the same build and ethnicity followed me, so I felt myself getting paranoid. This man kept his distance, but for instance, we went into the basketball area, and he would come to the entrance and lean against the gate, just watching us. He could go behind the trees. It was clear he knew his way around this park, and follow us, which I wouldn't notice if it wasn't for his bag. I wanted to confront him, but I was with my younger brother and didn't want to cause trouble. I wasn't really scared, but more angry and frustrated. The man suddenly starts getting braver and walking faster towards us, and so we decide to quickly run home even though we were only out for 15 minutes. I travel a ton for work. I drive everywhere and have developed an affinity for stopping in as many mom and pop cafes and truck stops as possible in every tiny town in my state. I've met a ton of great people and eaten food made with love and pride. However, one time I was sitting at a lunch counter when a trucker struck up a conversation with me. We talked about diner food, sci-fi, and the anonymity of traveling the backroads. Then, out of nowhere, he starts talking about serial killers and how interested in them he is. He described his library of books on the subject, his favorite pieces of serial killer items he has collected, and who he thought was the scariest. So yeah, I'm creeped out by the guy who has noted the anonymous nature of road travel and has a genuine love of serial killers. I let the conversation peter out and finished my meal. As I am paying my tab, the dude asks if I want to check out his rig, as I had mentioned thinking big rigs are ducking sweet. I noped the duck straight out of there immediately. For 30 minutes or so, I was checking my rear view, fully expecting to see that truck coming up on my bumper. I have never been back in that place since. I was 10 years old, and my aunt had a small 100-acre farm that was also used as a livery yard for horses. I had a pony called Toffee. We often had kids come into our fields from the neighboring park. They would antagonize the livestock and horses, set dogs on the sheep, set fire to hay, and just generally cause stress and damage. We were told to stay away, ignore them, and tell an adult if we saw them. The police often did nothing as the kids would escape onto the park, and the council refused for us to close off the public footpaths through the fields. It was a true misery. I went to catch my pony from the field and saw he was sweaty and wide-eyed. I don't think he understood for a moment that he was safe with me from this frightened look he gave me. I suddenly realized there were 6 people in the copse of our field. I was suddenly frightened and tried to encourage Toffee to come with me quickly. Initially, the boys ran. I believe that when they saw how small I was and that I was no threat, the group made their way back towards me. The field was 5 acres, and this all occurred in one of the corners. 3 of them dropped their trousers and flashed at me. Keep in mind that I was a 10-year-old little girl who did not understand but had an idea of what was implied. In a panic, I went to grab my pony, but he was scared of them and backed away. One of the boys shouted, "If you touch that horse, I'm going to kill you." Toffee, in that moment, charged briefly towards them. I don't know if it was a fight, not a flight kicking in, or if he sensed my terror, but it was enough to scatter the boys. I started to turn and bolt as fast as my legs could carry me towards the gate. One of the boys chased after me. I obviously screamed for my life and felt his hand briefly run over my hair before he fell over. I sprang the gate and ran down the drive to the barn where my aunt and mom were. I always wonder if I had not run in that moment or if Toffee had not charged at them, I'd be alive. The field was far from safety. My parents would leave me for hours alone at the farm. There was a forest and stream as well, so my small body could easily have been hidden. I still have Toffee, about 13 years later. He's 27 and a very old, grumpy pony. I'll keep him till he departs the world. He has given so much joy for the little he gave, and he might have saved me had he not taken off when he did. I decided to have a look at a culvert, covered stream, that I hadn't been down before. We weren't expecting it to be much, so no safety call-out, weather check, or even bother to let anyone know where the entrance is. Get about 750 meters in, and my buddy notices a load of water pouring in up ahead. We look at each other and go, "We need to get out now." In under 5 minutes, the water went from ankle deep and manageable to knee deep and almost pushing us over. We reached a section with some steps, a ladder, and a handrail, for inspection, and managed to push the lid off with the water getting deeper every minute. If that ladder had been 10 meters further, we might not have made it. If we'd slipped? Dead. When we got out, it was raining gently. We were soaking wet and just looked at each other with that "oh duck" look. A bit more above ground exploring, and we worked out that the culvert went under a local canal. If we'd slipped, we'd have ended up in a sump under a canal and likely never made it out. Nobody knew where we were, what was happening, or how to find us. In all likelihood, the only time they'd know where we died was when our corpses got spat out into the nearby river. A combination of stupidity and stupid good luck, I guess. I got an Airbnb in Fort Worth at what seemed to be a spiritual retreat. We arrived at a padlocked gate with cameras, and the lady who opened the door had no shoes on. Looking around, there was furniture and overgrown shrubbery everywhere. The main house was dilapidated with rotting wood. We went inside, and they asked me and my girlfriend to sign waivers. This was the first red flag. We then walked out of the house to where we would be sleeping. While we walked through the compound, we saw other people who seemed somewhat normal, also without shoes. Our bedroom was an old RV near the back of the property. This RV was collapsed at the front, and they tried to cover it up with a bed sheet. After trying to reason why this situation was okay, me and my girlfriend decided to look around to make sure it wasn't as sketchy as we were making it out to be. During our walk, we saw these long wooden boxes that had strange labels on them. I was getting very cult vibes from the people there as well. Some of them seemed entranced. Then, a little girl came up to us, also, no shoes, and started talking to us. The conversation was friendly at first, but then took a turn. She said something along the lines of, "What if I cut someone up with a knife and put them in the oven?" At first, I thought she was being sarcastic or joking, but she kept following us and talking about cutting people up and cooking them, and then that's when I knew I needed to get us the duck out of there. I told the lady that me and my girlfriend wanted to get dinner in town so she could open the gate for us and let us out without arousing suspicion. Later on, I saw the main guy I met at the Airbnb in the Flat Earth Convention video by All Gas No Brakes on the internet. I've always lived in the woods, even as a kid, with my parents. I had a pretty atypical childhood compared to many folks my age. I didn't have internet until I left for college, and we very rarely went to a grocery store. My parents were pretty well off, but instead of fancy cars or vacations, they wanted to live semi-off the grid and farm, hunt, or raise animals for themselves. I was in the forest a lot for hunting, maintaining our trails, or fishing, all kinds of redneck shit. Never, even from an early age, was I ever afraid of the woods. Even by the time of this story, I'd probably done more backpacking and wilderness hunting than most do in a lifetime. I was visiting home from college because, as anyone in rural America can tell you, the beginning of deer season is an unofficial holiday. It was nearly the end of the day, and the light was dying. I packed my SHT up and climbed out of my stand. When I got to the ground and turned around, there was this guy staring at me. There was nothing ghostly about him, in the sense that I could have sworn I could reach out and touch him. It was weird how he didn't seem to be dressed correctly. At first, I thought he was lost. He looked Hispanic, and the surrounding orchards would hire a lot of seasonal migrant workers. But I started to get panicked when I realized he was dressed in what looked like a prison uniform, but not a current one, if that makes sense. In fact, everything about the guy screams straight from the 1980s, from his hairdo to his prison uniform. I must have been visibly panicked. My parents' property isn't super close to a prison, but close enough that once in my childhood escapes were hidden out in the area, and the guy put his hands up in like a calming gesture. But I still wasn't having any of that shit because I feel like that's exactly what a murderer would do. I was obviously armed, and while I didn't quite point my gun at him, I certainly arranged myself in a way to exude the fact that I could in fact shoot him quite easily. He didn't look very concerned by that fact. If anything, he acted a tad disappointed, like I'd offended him. But he heaved a melodramatic sigh and then looked at me with a face that nearly made me piss myself. I don't think it was downright hostile, but it was the kind of face I'd expect a kid to make right before he pulls some prank that he knows is going to piss you off. Mischievous. It made my blood go ice cold. But then he held up a finger, smiled wider, and said, "Fine, I'll be going again, partner," and he sidestepped behind a tree, and I swear to God he was just ducking gone. I looked all around, but it hadn't been dark enough for me to just lose him in the dark. Also, deer season is in the fall, so the ground is littered with leaves. I'm literally a hunter and tracker by profession, and I'd like to think I'd have heard or seen signs of even a careful departure, much less his hasty one. No disturbed leaves or anything. I was absolutely baffled. I know I made this long, but the actual thing happened in less than 10 seconds. Maybe less than 5. It took me a couple of minutes after searching to finally accept that the homeboy had just vanished. I'll admit there is some schizophrenia in my family, but I've literally had no other symptoms of it, and I work in an industry that's prone to making people hear bumps in the night. I was pretty concerned. I even went to the doctor, but while she politely insisted I probably didn't see a ghost, that also didn't mean I was insane. She gave me something to help me sleep, but that was that. I never really brought it up to many other people. Or anyone, really. I don't think this would actually happen, but I'd hate for some trouble to come up at work if they thought me nuts. I don't really think about it anymore, but I think that's by choice. It's never kept me out of the woods or made me afraid of the dark, but I'll admit that every now and then, if I'm on a trip with just my pup, I'll get a little anxious at that time of the evening, wondering if the dude is still out there. To my credit, I've never seen him or anything like him again. I was backpacking with my dog and about 12 miles from the road and trailhead, so pretty far from people, though popular enough that other hikers might be around, though we saw no one all day. About 2 a.m., my dog started this really deep growl and woke me up. Turn on my headlamp and see his teeth showing, and he's right on top of me. I hear heavy footsteps. Black bear or moose? Near the tent. I leash my dog so he doesn't tear through the tent, and the footsteps move further away, but they keep circling my tent. All of my food and toiletries are hung on a tree in a bear bag. There is nothing in the tent to draw a bear's attention. I clap my hands. Something is still slowly circling, not something a moose would do, and a bear might if he wanted food, but I've got nothing and a really big dog with me. I decide to step out of the tent with the leash in one hand and bear spray in the other, yelling, "Hey bear!" The footsteps stop, the dog's nose is in the air, telling me to look right, but there is nothing in my headlamp that I can see. I didn't hear anything run off, but it's quiet. I give it 5 minutes or so, get back in the tent, and it starts up again, slowly circling maybe 50 feet from me. Maybe an hour later, I hear the footsteps wander off into the woods. At dawn, I take the dog and the bear spray and start looking for tracks. I find a clear path in the leaves that have been trampled, but no tracks. The dog's nose is on the ground, and I follow his lead, and he follows the loop around our campsite. We finally see a few human footprints, not shoe tracks, a regular size, not Bigfoot, bare human foot. Plus, yup, a human turd and toilet paper. Some hole was wandering around the middle of nowhere, near the tent, and circling my tent for an hour or more before leaving. In 2020, my mom, F60S, and I, F30S, decided to go on an overnight camping trip together on the Oregon coast. I picked what looked like a pretty campsite from a campsite app, and off we went. When we got there, we realized it was right off the highway, but there were enough trees and a fence up front that you couldn't really see the road. But the gate was just a metal gate that swung into place, there were no locks. There was a house on either side, but the property was fenced in on both sides. We pitched the tent pretty far back, close to the woods on the back of the property. The closest house was about 100 yards away, and the highway was about 200 yards, but again, it was all mostly fenced in and surrounded by tall firs. It was a lovely sight, and my mom raved about how beautiful and peaceful it was. I will say that I got a feeling of dread as soon as we walked onto the property, but we arrived late, and I didn't know if we'd be able to get a new spot quickly. My mom could tell I was nervous, but for some reason I put her enjoyment of the beauty of the campsite over my feeling of dread. We made a nice campfire and enjoyed some hot chocolate as we watched the fire. I kept an eye out and didn't see or hear anything odd. My mom went to bed before I did, and I stayed up and watched the fire for a long time before going to bed. Finally, I tucked in, very exhausted from staying up. At about 2 a.m., I awoke to twigs snapping and what sounded like someone dragging their fingers on the side of the tent, up to the front. I sat up and grabbed my phone and the only weapon I had, a large flashlight, and unzipped my sleeping bag in case I needed to fight anyone. There was a full moon that night, and I couldn't tell if it was a person's shadow falling on the tent or if it was a tree branch shadow moving from the wind. It sounded like there were two people outside trying to be quiet. We had brought our boots inside, so there was no indication outside of who was in the tent. It felt like they were trying to gauge the tent while I was listening to where they were. I had made sure to make enough noise so they knew someone inside was alert, but no more than that. If they know someone is awake, they can't surprise us. But they also don't know who is inside or whether or not we have guns. I sat there in the dark until dawn. My mom slept through the whole thing. When we got up and out of the tent, small things had been moved. Our camp chairs had cup holders. One cup that had been in a cup holder was on the ground. A pen that had been in a cup holder was also on the ground. My mom raves about how good her sleep was and how refreshing it was to camp there, so I didn't want to burst her bubble or scare her. We packed up, and I didn't tell her, but I let her have a nice memory of deep rest and relaxation while camping on this beautiful property. Was it someone living in the woods? Someone walking down the highway in the middle of the night? Creepy neighbors? Who knows? My mom had a great experience, and I got a refund and a fear of camping. The property owner said they might set up cameras to keep an eye on things in the future. People scare more than almost anything else that could be out there. We were sailing around a big lake with my then boyfriend. It takes several days to do the full circle if you're not super fit, and we wanted to make it into a nice holiday. There are many camping sites by the lake, big, crowded places, and not quite quiet, secluded grounds. We were students back then, aiming for the cheapest camping spots. In this one camping site, the cheapest spots were situated by the fence. Well, it wasn't a very massive fence. On the other side of it ran the bike trail and the train trail too, so it was busy. We thought it would do it for the night, and yet again, we were surrounded by other campers, though not super close. I'm quite a light sleeper, I would wake up for any noise, but my boyfriend was fast asleep. In the middle of the night, I was jerked awake by the noise of someone unzipping our tent, and suddenly I felt a hand touching my foot. I guess they were looking for stuff that they could move easily, like our bags, wallets, and phones, but those things weren't within reach, they were piled up next to our heads. It was so surreal and happened so quickly that I didn't know how to react, so I just started kicking whoever it was. Fortunately, I managed to scare them away. In the morning, we saw that the fence behind our tent was tempered. I was terrified and kept thinking about what if they had a knife on them or something. In Hungary, it's not easy to get a firearm. After that, I got a little lock so our tent couldn't be unzipped from the outside. I was out with my girlfriend Sunday evening for a walk in the park, and I suggested we try a new one on the way. The entrance to the park is a narrow trail with tall grass on both sides, leading deeper into the woods. After a few minutes of walking, we noticed a tall man wearing a white tank top and shorts standing alone on the trail, looking at us. I whispered to my girlfriend, "That's not creepy at all," and proceeded to take a different path in the fork ahead of us. We continued on a trail that ended up taking us down a narrower path with trees on both sides. As we were walking in a field, GF leading the way, I heard something like a branch snapping behind us, which made me stop to listen. I shortly concluded it was just an animal or a coincidence. It was starting to get nearly pitch black, so we had to turn on the flashlight on our phones and decided to head back before it was too dark. I was now walking in front, and it just took a few steps before I was face to face with the guy in the white tank top. He was sneaking behind us with no light on, following us in the dark. I shined my light towards him, and he looked like a deer in headlights, like someone who got caught red-handed. My fist was instinctively clenched, and I had a really bad feeling about him. I was sure it was going to go south, and I was ready to fight. As we approached to go past him, he said good evening. I replied with a confident good evening to show him no fear and continued our way back. I looked back after a few steps, and he was still standing at the spot where we crossed him and was looking in our direction. I told my girlfriend to go in front, and we ran the FCK back to the exit and got in the car. Relieved, we were talking about what just happened and realized the intensity of it. A few minutes later, we see the man walking out of the trail fast. I don't know what he was hiding there or what was at the end of that trail, but I'm glad we turned back fast. We both felt bad vibes from him and believed he was up to no good. I live in a rural area surrounded by a nature conservation area. There are many nice paths, and it's a great, peaceful, and quiet place to go for walks, ride bikes, etc. On this day, I decided to take my dog for a walk there in the evening. I didn't want to go that far. For some reason, I decided to leave my phone at home, even though I usually take it with me, just in case. Everything was going well, and, as usual, I barely met anyone. At some point, I got to my favorite spot, a wooded area. There is a field behind it, and I planned on walking all the way to the end. Then I wanted to turn around and take the same way home. As I continued walking after I made it through the wooded area, my dog started acting strange. She kept looking back and didn't want to go on. I thought she had spotted a deer or a rabbit and wasn't concerned. I didn't look around right away. But then she let out a little growl or bark. I had never heard her do that before. I turn around, and sure enough, there is a man standing on the edge of the wooded area or field, maybe 10 meters next to the path. He was fully clothed and didn't move. He was just staring at us. My heart was pounding. No matter where I went, I would still be in a secluded area for a while. I didn't think and just started walking quickly towards the end of the field. My dog still wasn't having it. When I turned around after getting a bit further away, he had also moved. Now he was standing on the field, still staring intensely. That's when I really knew we had to get going. I didn't look back until we got to the end of the field. Because of some trees, my view was obstructed. I couldn't see him, and my dog seemed a bit calmer. Obviously, I didn't want to stop for more than a few seconds. From there on, I decided to take the path that would take me to some part of my town the quickest. We literally ran, and I was so relieved when we made it back to civilization. I have no idea what his intention was. I'm just proud of my dog for alerting me. When I was about 13 or 14, my friends and I were hanging out and met up in the local park or woods. We'd been walking down one of the pathways in the woods when we noticed a weird noise behind us. Turning around, there was one armed man who looked quite old, 60 plus, in scruffy clothing with a dog, and he seemed to be breathing quite heavily. We immediately became quite uneasy as he was staring right at us and shuffling along quickly towards us, so being young kids, we ran off, squealing up some stairs leading to a bridge. Once we were on the bridge, we looked down at the man, sure we were being silly, and he would just be shuffling along on his way, walking his dog, probably shaking his head at the idiot children. But no, there he was, head craned up, eyes glued to us, speedily limping towards the stairs we had just run up. Immediately, we freaked out and ran as quickly as we could along the path and split up the two forks in the path, knowing that both paths had a point that met up further along. We ran as quickly and quietly as we could until we met at the point and started babbling about the man, trying to decide if he was following us or not and if it was safe to go back the way we came, as that was the quickest and safest way back to the park's playground. Eventually, we came to the conclusion that we would sneak back along the more open, visible pathway and scope out if the guy was still there or if our imaginations had run awry. We were in the clear and thinking we had just been imagining things right up until we got to the bridge. There, slowly limping down the stairs, were the man and his dog. Stupidly, we shouted out in shock, and he turned, saw us, and turned around to start making his way back up the stairs, eyes fixed on us. We turned and ran, screaming. Back along the pathway, we kept going, taking random turns, getting lost, and cutting through the trees off the pathway until we had reached a main trail and had put enough distance in. From there, we rushed back to the family-packed playground and didn't go back into the woods for a while. Even now, over 10 years later, we still wonder why the man was so determined to follow us and what he wanted, and it still creeps us out whenever we discuss it. This happened when I was probably 13 or 14, so sometime around 2013. I live in a very small town, no stores, not even a gas station, population less than 1,000, in New England. My friend and I, after a day of school, decided to take a walk on an old rail trail behind my house. This rail trail goes on for miles and crosses several states, almost in a perfect line. These days, it is not in use, and there are not even train tracks anymore, just a long path. That being said, many people in town use it for walks, bikes, riding horses, etc. Anyway, on this day, we decided to take a walk, which we rarely did. So, we walk up behind my house and start walking down the trail. We probably make it a mile and then turn around to head back. While heading home, one of our topics of discussion was horror movies. We both got a little spooked thinking about all the scary stuff, but it wasn't like we felt truly unsafe and scared in that moment, it was just the thoughts. Because of those scary thoughts, I felt a need to turn and look behind us. Behind us, about 100 feet, I see a man walking wearing a long black coat, trench coat-like. He is also holding something in his hand. The second he sees me turn my head and look at him, he begins sprinting towards us. I say to my friend run, she turns to look, and well, we ducking ran like our lives depended on it. We ran all the way home and went to my barn, which is at the top of the hill on my property, so it was the closest safe space in relation to the trail. Still, to this day, no one has believed us, but there was just something off. Could he have just been a jogger resuming his run after a break? I guess so. But why the long coat, and what was he holding? Like I said, my town is extremely small, there is absolutely no crime here, so it may have been hard for others to believe there were any malicious intentions, but like I said, it felt wrong, and the way he just began sprinting towards us when I saw him still haunts me to this day. He just looked menacing. I was hiking with my dog on a well-known trail, but we kept going deeper into the woods. Most people usually turn around and head back, but I was curious how far the trail would go. As we kept hiking, I kept getting the feeling to turn around, but I shrugged it off. My pup and I are avid hikers and do this all of the time, so it didn't faze me that I was in the middle of nowhere alone. We kept going, and the feeling kept getting stronger. I ignored it. Then, out of nowhere, a guy was behind us. I never heard or saw him hike behind us this whole time. He didn't look like an average person either, he looked creepy, and I felt scared. The strangest thing that happened was that as he was approaching us, my dog started growling and went after his ankles as he passed us. She has never done that to anyone in her whole life. She's a lover and is friendly. She picked up something strange from him right away. I didn't want to keep going deeper into the woods now, knowing he was behind us, so that's why we stopped to let him pass. I just said to him as he passed, "I'm so sorry," she's usually very friendly, and we just took off back as he went forward. As soon as we turned around a corner where he couldn't see us, we literally ran the whole way back until we were closer to other hikers. I know he didn't do anything, but there was definitely a very creepy feeling that was very unsettling for both my dog and myself. And the fact that I kept feeling like I should turn around, and I've never felt that on any other hike before, was interesting too. Ever since that happened, I've learned a good lesson: I'll never hike alone like that again. I was living with my dad and stepmother at the time, and I remember my stepmother throwing a royal fit about buying me new school clothes because I had let a few pairs of pants get holes in them and still wore them. It was my first year going to high school, and I wasn't going to let her spoil that for me, so I went to stay with my grandparents for the summer to earn some money. They live in a remote, small area that was once home to many native tribes, most prominently the Quinault tribe. It's very secluded despite being only a mile or so from the highway, and it's all lush, gorgeous forest. My grandpa had built his own 3-story house and a shop where he cut and assembled cedar into roofing products. That's where I came in, hauling heavy chunks of cedar to his van, stacking, nailing, and cinching up shake and shingle into bundles to be sold. I made good money while there and was able to buy an entire new wardrobe. As summer was coming to an end and it was too hot to work, I decided to take a walk one day. Now, let me say that I spent my childhood roaming these woods. Armed with my grandparents' 2 dogs, we ran, played, and napped all day, and I had never seen anything out of the ordinary or gotten any weird vibes. I waited until it was a bit cooler in the evening and started out, walking a little path that would take me out to an old, unused logging road. I had tread this same path so many times that I wasn't even paying attention until I felt I was being watched. I would like to note here that I was young at the time, I had yet to touch drugs or alcohol, and I have no history of hallucinations or mental illness along those lines. What I saw still haunts me to this day. There he was, standing naked in the middle of my path, looking down at me with a blank expression. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, much taller than my 5 foot nothing. He had long, matted black and gray hair, and there were tufts of it growing from the sides of his arms and legs as well. There were no genitals, only smooth flesh where they should be. And his skin, which was such a sickly pale yellow, looked too big for his stature and hung in some spots. We made eye contact, and his yellow orbs felt like they were staring into my soul. I couldn't move or think, everything had gone silent around me. The next 10 or so seconds of my life seemed to stretch out. We just stood looking at one another before he swiftly turned and walked back into the trees. The foliage went undisturbed as he melted through it and disappeared. I honestly expected him to charge me or at least be intimidating, but he just turned and left. I haven't seen him since either, nor am I too enthusiastic to go out looking. One time I was camping in Canada and doing a little driving and sightseeing. I hiked this trail that led to Lake Superior, and there were these old, creepy cottages. They were really run down, missing windows, and mostly boarded up. It was a bright summer day, and I didn't think anything of them other than, oh, neat. So, I sit on a log by the beach for a few minutes before I decide to head back to my car. No sooner do I stand up, than this dude comes sprinting out of one of the abandoned cottages. I didn't see if he came out of a window or if one of the boarded up doors was loose or what, but I stood up, heard a kind of thudding sound, and turned around in time to see this dude sprinting from the porch of one of those cottages. Luckily, he was heading away from me. He sprints down the same trail that I needed to hike down to get back to my car. I wait a few minutes and then head down the trail. The trail is straight only for maybe 100 yards, so I don't see the guy. I keep my eyes peeled, looking all around as I walk back to my car. I round a final bend in the trail and know the trailhead is right around the corner, and I'm starting to breathe easily. I round the corner, and there's the sprinter standing behind a red car parked next to mine. He's moving something in the trunk. When I arrived at this trailhead, there were no other cars. I have no idea where this car came from, and I search for another person, maybe picking up the sprinter or something, but I don't see anyone. I figure the sprinter had probably been at the trailhead for a good half hour before I got there. The sprinter sees me and closes the trunk. He stands there and watches me as I go to my car. I say hello, and he just stares at me. I quickly get in my car and drive off. I look in my rearview mirror and see that the sprinter is in the red car, and he's a little ways behind me. That freaks me out. I drive maybe 10 minutes before there is a scenic pull-off with several cars and people, so I pull into the pull-off. I park, get out, and stand kind of near the other people enjoying the scenic area. The red car pulls into the lot, and the sprinter just sits in the car. After several minutes, one large group leaves, and there's just a couple, me and the sprinter. The couple begin to walk down a trail off the parking lot, and I hustle back to my car before I'm all alone with the sprinter again. So, I hop in my car and drive off. For a few minutes I don't see the red car following me, and then 1 second I look down, and the next I look up, and the sprinter is there in the red car, just maybe 1/4 mile behind me. I speed up and try to lose him. As soon as the red car is out of sight, I do a quick U-turn and head back in the other direction. I pass the sprinter in the red car, and he looks at me. I see him do a U-turn, but I'm flying well over the speed limit at this time. I lose sight of him behind me again, and then I pull off into the same scenic overlook, which overlooks the highway, the beach, and the lake, but the cars can't really be seen from the highway. I'm in the overlook parking lot watching to see the red car, and I see it drive past. I watch it driving south until I can't see it any longer, and then I drive north, going well above the speed limit for another half hour or so. That night I got a hotel room and didn't bother trying to camp, as I would have never been able to get to sleep. Around a year ago, I was standing by an entrance to the park, maybe 20 feet inside of it. At 2 a.m. it was pitch black, I couldn't see a few feet in front of me. The only light is the faint twinkle of streetlights beyond the far side of the park. As I'm standing there, Earphones in with music as always, I could have sworn I saw some movement in the distance. I squint my eyes and focus on a spot on the far side, trying to make out what I noticed, for maybe 10 seconds. At this point, I realize I'm not looking into the distance, I'm looking directly at someone a mere 10 or so feet in front of me. I shit you not, that feeling of realization is the single most powerful thing I have ever felt in my life. I felt like I was in a horror movie. Heart racing, I turn around, book it to the entrance behind me, and start walking down the street towards my home. I'm fairly shaken up, but there's nothing to indicate the guy had any sinister intentions or even knew I was there. Could have been doing the same thing as me. I'm now under the street lights, walking past some well-off houses, which felt like safety to me. However, I then turned around and saw a hooded man, a stereotypical roadman as we would call them, emerge from the same entrance as me and turn my direction. He was around the same distance I would have expected had I started leaving at the same time. Around 10 to 15 feet behind me again, nothing sinister, probably, I thought. But just to be careful, I picked up the pace a bit. This street is around 200 feet before it merges with a main road. After around halfway, I turned around and saw this guy directly behind me, 10 feet away, as he was earlier. I think to myself, well, that's weird. I'm walking pretty fast, and this guy has kept up. So now I start to walk as fast as I possibly can without breaking out into a run. I specifically remember going as fast as a walk would allow me to. I maintain this for another 100 feet until I get to the main road. Then I turn around, and this guy is literally 5 feet behind me. He is cooler than he was before I sped up rapidly. Borderline pant shitting moment. I was full on ran all the way home, barefoot in sliders, BTW, without looking behind me until I got to my front door, and that was that. I never saw him again. I was backpacking with my boyfriend in the mountains in Colorado. The area was fairly popular, with a big parking lot and a few trails that split off in different directions. We had passed through a big valley and were making our way up through steep woods with lots of switchbacks. We were carrying good-sized packs and planned to camp in an alpine meadow above. It was summer, good weather, and good times. I have a few guns, and I brought one that I hadn't hiked with before. A Smith & Wesson 4-inch 686. It was heavy. We took turns carrying it in the holster, in hand, not on my hip like I do with my smaller and lighter 3-inch Smith. I had started with it on my hip, but it was too big, awkward, and heavy. My boyfriend is carrying the gun as we turn past another switchback. We see a guy coming down the trail towards us. A few unusual things immediately caught our attention. 1, he didn't have a backpack, water, or any gear at all. We were a few miles in, so someone should at least have water. 2, he was wearing surgical type gloves. For real. Not regular outdoor gloves. Not some newfangled hipster outdoor gloves from REI. Actual surgical gloves, in the middle of the forest. He had an extremely creepy expression. Eyes are too big and wide. Icky, too big smile. My boyfriend and I exchanged a few quick words before he reached us, getting mentally prepared. My boyfriend had the gun if we needed it, and we stepped off the trail slightly so he wouldn't pass too close. He just smiled his creepy smile and went past. Because my boyfriend was carrying that heavy gun in his hand, still holstered, that dude knew we had a gun. It obviously wasn't pointed at the guy, but he knew. As we went on, my boyfriend and I kept stopping and checking to be sure he wasn't coming back behind us. Not far past this, we saw a bit of blue tarp poking out from behind a large rock. We both thought it could be a body or something, so my boyfriend checked, and wasn't happy to have that job. Just a tarp. Crumpled but in good shape, it seemed to have been put there recently. I'm not sure why it would be way up there, though. We eventually reached the alpine lake and camped. Nothing bad happened. There was another couple somewhat nearby on one side of the lake, which made me feel better. Normally, I'd rather be alone after backpacking. But they were closer to the trail, so if the crazy dude came back, maybe he'd go after them first and we would hear something. I know, that's really horrible to think or say that. But they were a buffer. Anyway, nothing bad happened. But we never forgot that, dude. I am so glad I wasn't alone. Why no gear or water, but surgical gloves and a lunatic expression a few miles in on a mountain trail?